Okay, what's up everybody? My name is Kyle. I make music for my band Archaeologist, and I'm making this video today to show you guys how I actually went through the process of making 8-bit versions of my band's songs for the 8-bit remix EP we put out last year. I'm going to start by saying that my way is definitely not the fastest or easiest way to go about doing this, but my goal with the project was to make something that sounded good enough and detailed enough to actually put out as an official release for my band. And for me, that meant being able to have more flexibility with the sounds than what I would be able to achieve with some of the easier methods. So to start off, here is just an example of one of my original songs compared with the 8-bit version for some context. Okay, so that kind of gives you an example of one of the original songs versus the 8-bit remix. And the way I produced these was basically a multi-step process that involves going through multiple different pieces of software. So I'm going to break this video down into about 4 or 5 different sections where I take you through those steps one by one. I'm also going to include links to all of the software involved down in the description. A lot of it's free, some of it you guys may have already if you've been producing other kinds of music on your own. So to start off with, we're going to be working in one of my favorite musical tools and something I absolutely cannot live without, which is Guitar Pro. Okay, so first of all, this may be obvious to you already, this may not, but I think some people have misconceptions about sort of how this works. If you are trying to make 8-bit versions of your songs, you can't start just from an audio file. Like you can't have, say, just like an MP3 or a WAV file of your song and then expect to somehow convert that to something that sounds like 8-bit. It needs to start with either a MIDI file or something like Guitar Pro here that can export a MIDI file. And so Guitar Pro is something that I've been using for years and years, but it's basically a tablature program which I use to write out my songs, build my arrangements, punch in whatever random riffs I'm coming up with for kind of archiving and organizing for future use. But it's something where you actually punch in the notes and the rhythms by hand to build a virtual version of your song. And so it sounds something like this with all the different tracks combined here. You can hear I'm going through, like, we're looking at the guitars here, some more guitars in this layer, here's the drums, and there's some bass up here. But the point is that once you have your song written out in something like this, or maybe some other sort of digital sheet music program, you can actually go up and export that as a MIDI file, which is basically just a data file that contains all of the information for your song in terms of these notes are happening at these times, these are the rhythms and the spaces, this is the tempo and all of the other information involved. It basically exports a file with all that info so that you can just run that through a different program that's going to basically read through your music and play it through whatever synth sounds you want. And so to do that from Guitar Pro, you just go up here, you go File, Export, and then you can export as MIDI. And when you do this, it's going to save a single file that contains all of your different tracks from your song. And so once we export this file, the next step is to basically take that and drag that into these other programs. I use 2 other pieces of software in particular, which I'll show you guys now. Okay, so once we have our song all written out in Guitar Pro and then exported as a MIDI file, the next step that I personally went through in my own process was to bring that file into this nice little free program called GXSCC, and I'll have a link to download this in the description. It's an 8-bit tracker, basically. And this actually only runs on PC, and right now I'm working on a Mac, so what we're looking at is just a screenshot of the GXSCC editor, so I can't actually click on anything here. But basically, there's separate little channels here for each instrument in your MIDI file. So if you had like 5 different tracks in your Guitar Pro song, you're going to have 5 different channels filled in here in GXSCC. And they're not going to be labeled, but you can basically click here to mute and unmute each channel and figure out what instrument's what. And this is something where I said earlier that my process wasn't really the fastest way to do it. What I mean by that is that you can actually just bring your song into something like this, and call it a day, because you are going to get something played back to you that's an 8-bit version of your song. But the reason I didn't want to kind of settle at that was because you don't really get much control over your mix or the tones you use or any details in terms of like if you want different sections in the song to sound different, if you want layers that come in and out, you really don't have any control over that. It's kind of just bring it in and then that's it. And so like if you click up here on config, you'll see that you do have some options to change in your sound where you can adjust what they call the instrument set and use different synth tones for the different channels, etc. But even though I didn't use all of this, the reason I'm bringing it up is because I did use GXSCC for my drum tracks. I basically just brought in my MIDI files, muted everything other than the drums, and then used that to build into my song in Logic later on, which will be the next step. But yeah, I did really like the actual drum sounds in GXSCC, and it was something that I struggled to figure out how to properly make in Logic. I didn't really find a good 8-bit drum kit or anything like that, or a way to make it on my own. Maybe there are ways that I didn't come across, but this is what ended up working for me. And actually, one small thing I want to mention here too is that once you have heard your MIDI file played back to you within GXSCC, you may want to take that information back to your Guitar Pro or whatever program you were using and adjust your MIDI file to compensate for a few things. And what I mean by that is that, like, for example, I remember when I first just brought in my MIDI file, certain drum hits were really loud, like way louder than the rest of the mix. And when I went back to my Guitar Profile, what I noticed was that in some parts I may have had certain cymbals overlaid, for example, if I've got like a hi-hat and a crash at the same time. The way that those cymbal hits are mapped into GXSCC may not be exactly how they're played back in Guitar Pro, and you end up with extra drum hits and sounds in there that you don't want. So I think I actually went back and took out pretty much all the crash cymbals, and I definitely took out any cymbal that was overlapping with another one, so that you never have more than just one drum and one cymbal at the same time. Again, that's just what I ended up noticing and sort of adjusted to compensate. But just make sure you check it here, see if there's anything you want to change, and then move forward from there. And so once you are satisfied with whatever you're hearing in GXSCC, whether it's for certain instruments, for the full song, for just the drums, whatever, you can go up here to where it says authoring. If you click that, it lets you export your file as an actual audio wave file. And at that point, you can take that and bring that into Logic or whatever other workstation you're using and build your song from there. And so the next step is to take the original MIDI file we worked with, along with the new drum audio file we exported from GXSCC, and take those over to Logic, which is where we're going to do the bulk of our actual producing and arrangement work. Okay, so once we've got our MIDI file and whatever audio we're exporting from GXSCC, the next step is to bring everything over into Logic or whatever digital audio workstation you prefer to produce in. And so what we're looking at here is basically this one giant scary Logic project that I used to produce the entire 8-bit EP. I've actually been leaning towards this kind of whole album in one project approach for a while now, because it just makes it so much easier when you want to, say, adjust the guitar tones or something on a song and then have it apply to everything, because now it's like you can make a uniform mix to your whole album in one shot without having to go and open 5 different projects back and forth. And this is kind of more of a general mixing approach thing that applies to more than just the 8-bit, but I just thought I'd explain why there's so much stuff going on in this one project here. So basically, when we look at this horizontally, it's like this is one song here, this is another song, it's another song here, etc. And then vertically, we're just looking at all of the different layers I ended up setting up, which we'll go through in a minute. And this is actually something that I haven't looked at for quite a while. I mean, I produced this like a year ago, so I honestly don't remember a lot of the exact details of this, so we're going to kind of go through and rediscover some of this together. So first of all, though, we're going to start by just dragging in our audio file from GXSCC, which will look something like this. Let me zoom in a little bit. This is just like our stereo drum track here. I more or less just used that exactly how it was. I think, looks like I put a couple of small effects on it. I did some light compression. I did some EQ, etc. on the drums. But that's pretty much ready to go. You can just drag that in and make sure that you've got your project tempo matching your drum track. So then the next step is to drag in the MIDI file we made in Guitar Pro, which is going to contain all of the tracks for your song, including a duplicate of the drum track. And so you can go through and delete the drum layer, which I've already done here, and then just use everything else for your song. And the way I did this was I kind of started with making a rough sound for each of the different instruments I wanted, like the rhythm guitar, the lead, the bass, etc. But then I ended up cutting apart these regions, layering things a lot, moving them around to different tracks, and that's why you just see so much stuff going on here, because it's like there's certain parts where I wanted one clean tone, maybe I wanted a different tone in a different part, etc. And this is the kind of flexibility that you're not going to get through any basic 8-bit MIDI tracker application. This is where you can actually go through and produce it as if you're producing a regular, song outside of just something that's 8-bit. And something that you'll see a lot in this project, both in the sort of audio editor here as well as in the effects editor on the left side, is that I have a lot of stuff that's grayed out. And anything that's grayed out is basically something that I tried at one point and then didn't end up using, but wanted to keep in there just for the sake of what if I go back to it later. And there are certain things that I did go back to later. That's just kind of my own personal process. I don't like to delete anything. I'm sure other people would advise against that or agree with it, whatever. People have their different styles. But I like to kind of keep traces of all of my past work, even things that I didn't end up liking that much, just so I can kind of still go back and compare and see, does this new thing really sound better? Because sometimes you just don't really know until you still have the old version there side by side. But that's why, like, over here you'll see for whatever track we're looking at here, it's like the delay is grayed out, all just different things I tried, thought I'd maybe go with, ended up not keeping, but I just wanted them there sort of to have a record of it. Another thing you may want to consider doing when you're building your 8-bit songs like this is making sure your parts all translate properly within the MIDI file. What I mean by that is cleaning up things that may not have carried over. And if you're working with guitar songs, that could be things like slides or bends. Different like effects may not really translate right. Like I've heard stuff with slides where it like the MIDI kind of reads it wrong. It like bends it up one note, but it's not the right note and it ends up all wacky. For that, you just want to go through and really kind of be conscious with like fixing these things and moving them around. And I added some details too with like, for example, if I've got like a guitar note in a solo that like slides out downwards, I added like a very quick kind of descending like a chromatic scale down in the MIDI to sort of emulate that. So like for example here, that little fall off there, right? That's just literally just went in and added a bunch of really short notes going downwards. So that's like stuff like that, it's just a nice little kind of detailed touch. I mean, you can spend as much time as you want on things like that. You can get really into it, get creative with it. But I just think it's worth thinking about the details of things like that. And on a similar note, something I ended up doing a lot too was actually reducing my parts in terms of taking notes out of big chords in particular. So like if you've got a strumming part and it's like, you're strumming 6 strings on the guitar. In MIDI, it's the difference between having like one note played versus 6 notes that ends up like 6 times as loud in some cases. And so for big chords, I ended up taking out a lot of notes that I deemed as non-essential that still kind of kept the quality of the chord. Like you want to hear that it's major chord, minor chord, whatever. But it's worth taking out redundant notes sometimes if you're getting inconsistencies part to part in terms of volume or tone. Again, just something that I think is worth being conscious of and just realizing is a factor when you're going through and trying to tweak your mixes, because sometimes it's not just the mix that you need to fix, sometimes it's the actual arrangement in terms of which notes you're telling your software to play back at you. And so in my songs, all of my synth tones were built one of two ways. Either I made them kind of from scratch using Logic synths, which I'll go through a little bit briefly. There's a lot of other, I'm sure, much better tutorials you can find for those on YouTube as well. But that was one way I built my sounds. The other is I did use a plugin called the Magical 8-bit plugin. I'll have a link for that in the description too. It's pretty nice. I did use it for like the rhythm guitars, a few other things. But I do recommend at least checking this one out, so check out the link for that in the description. And something I want to point out here is that in all of my different layers, which I'll be taking you guys through, see a lot of stuff here. In all of the different layers, you'll see lots of basically duplicates. Like these 3 here at the top are like the same MIDI being played through 3 different instruments at the same time. And I just did a lot of layering like that. It's probably honestly overkill, but I like being able to kind of carve out more detailed and richer sounds with different layers like this. So just to give you an example, like what we're looking at here is the first layer, which is the main rhythm guitar. That is a single layer of the 8-bit plugin, not panned, so just in the center. I've got a compressor, EQ, some other stuff on here basically. But then what I have on the next two channels are actually the same instrumental part played through slightly detuned synths, panned left and right, just to give it kind of almost a chorus effect, just to make it sound a bit more three-dimensional, which I realize on one hand kind of defeats the purpose of an 8-bit song, right? But I like the sound, so I did it, and that's basically what it comes down to. But here's like the left channel. Oh, and these are also an octave up. That's another thing, is I did a lot of octave layering just to make this kind of a, you know, much thicker sort of sound. And I think that's something that I do recommend at least trying out. You'll see a big difference in it, is stacking octaves of your parts just to make it sound big and bright and nice. And just, you know, I did those octaves by, you can double click on your region to bring up the piano roll editor. You actually see all your notes laid out. I just highlight the whole thing, and then I drag that up by 12 steps, and that gives you an octave shift. But so here's like the left and right panned. See, these are panned over, one to the left, one to the right, and they're pitch shifted a tiny bit here. See, -1 cents on this side. I think it's +1 on the other side. It's going to sound like this. And here's with all three. And suddenly, by doing that, you have this kind of three-dimensional stereo sound, which I ended up preferring a lot. So that's pretty much how I built what I called, I guess, the rhythm guitar parts. For the clean tones, I did something a bit different. I wanted sort of different sounds to separate what was the clean guitars versus the distorted guitars in the original recordings. So my clean tones ended up sounding like this. Got a little bit of echo on there as well. And for that, I basically just tweaked the settings in the Magical 8-bit plugin to make it a little bit less buzzy, a little bit more of a kind of pure sound. And I thought that sort of matched the clean tones a little bit better. But then again, for the cleans, I've got some extra layers in here too. Like, where was it? If we go up here, we've got this higher octave. And I just ended up liking how those higher octaves kind of played in, filled in a little bit of the space that I felt like was missing. Again, just experiment with this stuff, and don't be afraid to try things and kind of see what you like. I like messing around with the echo a little bit. I actually put this stereo spread effect on a couple of the tracks too. Probably negligible, but you know, in an A to B test, I ended up liking it better with that stereo spread sometimes. Okay, what else? So here's actually a big thing. So like I said before, I use Magical 8-bit plugin for some sounds, but not all. And the times that I didn't were basically times when I wasn't able to get whatever sound I was looking for out of the Magical 8-bit plugin for a few different reasons. And what I ended up using was the ES1 synth within Logic to kind of build my own tones. So like here's an example of a lead that I built with that. And something that you'll notice on that, especially on the long held out notes, is that I was able to build vibrato into these. And that's something that I actually struggled with for a while on this, because there wasn't really a good vibrato plugin that I had in Logic that worked the way that I wanted to, which was when I was trying to emulate real guitar tones in the 8-bit versions, especially for like the solos and things like that. Something that happens typically on guitar is like if you're holding a long note, you may pick it, it may be just held flat at first, and then you add vibrato as the note rings out to give it some sustain. And the only vibrato plugins I had were basically doing that kind of wavy vibrato effect right from the start of the note. And I wanted something that would fade into the vibrato, which is not possible with the default Logic plugins or with the Magical 8-bit plugin. But you can do that with the custom synths by using the low frequency oscillator here. You can see I had it adjust the pitch, but it's on this time delay so that when the note first kicks in, the note is played straight, and then the longer it's held, the more it starts to sort of wobble up and down. You'll hear that here. I'll play it again. And so by the end of that, the vibrato is on it pretty strong. And for anything like this, you guys can feel free to let me know if you want like screenshots of these effects or of my settings, anything like that, and I'm happy to share any of that too. But for the sake of this video, I don't feel like I need to go through and explain every little parameter I've got set on every one of these things. So if we go through, so we covered the rhythm guitars, we pretty much covered the leads. Again, my big thing with the leads was figuring out the vibrato and then adding some more echo. I know on the leads I have higher octaves in a lot of parts too. What else? We'll talk about the bass for a second because we haven't touched on that yet. Bass, I think I ended up using, one layer of the Magical 8-bit plugin combined with one layer of my own custom bass instrument built on the ES1 synth in Logic again. And I basically have those two layers played alongside each other for pretty much every part of every song, just to kind of give me my default bass tone. So it sounds like this combined. And again, the two parts to it. One, this is the Magical 8-bit plugin. And that's the lower end of the bass. For that, I did the triangle wave. And I set some stuff here. Again, I can post screenshots of any of this stuff if you guys have any particular questions. And that's just Magical 8-bit plugin with some EQ. And the other half is the higher part. Because what I noticed when I was listening to like Mega Man soundtracks and stuff like that of actual 8-bit music is that the bass isn't just bass. It actually has a pretty good amount of high end built into it as well. Because on a lot of these old audio devices, you only have a few different audio channels that can be played at once. And so if you've got, harmonies or something up on top, you kind of need a thick bass sound to carry the rest of it. And by doing that, you don't just want like a sub bass. You want something that actually has can actually carry melodies and stuff like that and be a bit more versatile in terms of filling up your sound. That's kind of what I observed from listening to these tracks, and that's why I actually layered in this higher octave for all of my bass parts, just to let them stick out a little bit more in the mix and make everything a bit brighter overall. And again, here is the combined sound. And then here's the full mix again, just to give you some context. Just gonna scroll through here and make sure I didn't miss anything. And I actually haven't shown you guys yet. This is how the drums ended up sounding. This is straight out of GXSCC. I like that those are some pretty authentic sounding drum hits that I had a hard time getting even remotely close to with other methods in Logic. Oh, and actually one more thing that I did add for fun. I actually added all these sounds literally the day before I submitted the EP for release. I actually went on YouTube and downloaded a bunch of sound effects from old Nintendo games and hid those in certain parts of the song. So like, for example, let's see. Yeah, so like in this part in the Sojourner going kind of into the first drop, there's this like Donkey Kong effect. I don't know, I thought that was cool. I basically went through and just added some stuff like that. Like I remember this part. It's kind of quiet, but here. That's the sound of like Kirby riding his Warp Star, one of the old Kirby games. Or actually here, this is probably my favorite sound effect moment on the EP. But right here, before the drop. That's like the Mario power-up sound, right? Everybody knows that, you know, kind of subconsciously hide some of these things in the mix. Just thought that'd be fun, and it happened to match pretty nicely with the tempo of that part too. Also really quick here, we can take a look at my sort of master effects chain, which is just some EQ here. I rolled off the low end and the high end a bit. I did add a bit crusher effect, kind of subtle, nice little distortion there. And I do this on all of my mixes, whether 8-bit or not, but I did add the adaptive limiter plugin at the end just to give it some extra volume without peaking. Okay, so just some final thoughts on this whole process and my sort of production mentality in general is that mixing is always a problem-solving process. I mean, first you do have to be able to identify your problems and figure out what you may not like in a mix or what you feel is missing. But then beyond that, it's just a matter of trying different things until you happen to stumble onto the thing that works. And so like when I started this process, I mean, I had no idea I was going to end up using the exact steps that I did. It's not like I foresaw all of this from the beginning. It was just driven one step at a time by specific needs and problems that I encountered. And so, I mean, that's how I ended up with so many different tracks. It's just one at a time. It's like the bass isn't thick enough, the guitars sound too plain, there's too many parts here, whatever it is. And so I ended up splitting it up until I arrived at this. So basically just what I'm saying is don't be afraid to try things. I mean, just get everything loaded in to your workspace and then just adapt from there one step at a time and just keep chiseling away at it until you have something that you're happy with. And then honestly, the other hard part, which is always the hardest for me during mixing, is knowing when to quit. Because it's also this thing where you're always trying to tweak it and make it better, and there's always a way to make it better, right, to an extent. But you eventually start to experience some diminishing returns. You can spend hours making tiny changes that may or may not make a difference. But it's like the further you get with it and the closer you get to your goal, the less the little changes start to matter. And so I do think there's a point where you need to just set some deadlines for yourself and say, okay, it's basically there. I'm going to give myself this much time to get it 100% of the way there, and then I'm going to call it. You know, it's good enough. It is what it is, and you have to just move on sometimes. And so I'm actually very happy with how this ended up, but it's like, you know, I remember there was still a point where everything was pretty much done. I mean, it was how it is now, and I was still coming back to it just to keep tweaking it. So I think you do need to eventually realize when you're at that point and kind of force yourself to say, okay, it sounds good, it's finished. Okay, so I guess that's pretty much it. Of course, feel free to let me know if you guys have any questions down in the comments. I'm happy to share, you know, more details on any specific steps because I know there's some things I kind of skimmed over here just for time. But hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully some of you guys can make some awesome 8-bit music using some of the steps and tricks that I had to figure out during this process as well. And I'll post a link to my own 8-bit album down in the comments. You can find it on Bandcamp, Spotify, whatever. Again, the band is called Archaeologist, and this is the 8-bit Remix EP.